Welcome to our introduction to NIST. This is a part of the ConnectWise Certify program, and as such, this is meant to be prerequisite training in the Cybersecurity Fundamentals for Sales and Cybersecurity Fundamentals for Engineers course that we offer at ConnectWise. Although this training is meant for that purpose, it really is a walkthrough of all of the basics of the NIST framework, and as such, could be viewed by anybody that has an interest in learning about it. I'm Joy Beland, and I'm part of the IT Nation cybersecurity team. I was an MSP myself for 21 years, and I know how hard it is to wrap your head around what good looks like in cybersecurity. We've created this training because we hear over and over again from MSPs that they lack the confidence to talk about cybersecurity. And when it comes to cybersecurity, conveying confidence is an absolute must. In the MSP community, many of us are learning about cybersecurity for the first time. The reason it's important to have a basic understanding of NIST is that NIST represents a gold standard for risk management, and risk management is the key to being resilient to cyber threats. If you understand NIST and how the framework works, you'll have more confidence in how you approach cybersecurity within your own MSP, being able to prioritize your investment and maximize each dollar spent to bring your cyber posture to a level that makes sense for you. As a small or medium business owner yourself, that is what you want, right? Then, having applied this framework to your own MSP, you'll be able to turn around and have the same conversation with your clients. This risk-based conversation is the key to cultivating the expertise that they are looking for and ensuring that the solutions you recommend are appropriate for their business. In short, being able to speak about NIST will help you build your confidence in providing cybersecurity solutions. You should have already watched the brief video named What is NIST and the Cybersecurity Framework to have an understanding of who NIST is and why the framework was developed in 2013. As you can see from this statement, NIST Cybersecurity Framework was developed for our nation's critical infrastructure, and therefore one might understand that this is hard to scale down to being applicable and reasonable for small businesses. On its own, NIST is a very comprehensive framework that most MSPs find daunting to properly apply with limited understanding and resources. If you're a 5-person MSP and you read through NIST on your own, you'll see what I mean. My goal is to teach NIST in a way that is meaningful to MSPs and to small businesses. NIST is a voluntary framework that realistically could develop into being mandatory in a similar form to GDPR. Currently, NIST is developing a subset of these controls to present to the MSP community called NIST for MSPs, which will aid in the cyber resilience of small businesses. As the separate publications for the NIST for MSPs guidelines come out, we'll be adding them to our curriculum so that we can assist the MSP community with the early adoption of these practices. The overall goal of the NIST framework is to understand, manage, and reduce the risk of cybersecurity, regardless of the size, the degree of the cybersecurity risk, or the company's sophistication. This is a tool to help apply principles and best practices of risk management to improve the security and resilience of your business. So let's take a look at what NIST is made of. Let's start with the acronym CSF. CSF stands for Cybersecurity Framework. It's made of 3 parts, and each reinforces the connection between business drivers and cybersecurity activities. What do we mean by that? NIST is taking into account the organization's goals and walks through the events that might threaten those goals. What is the business impact of a threat, right? The core portion of NIST details the communications of cybersecurity activities from the executive level through the operations and implementation level. A core can be viewed as the discovery process, if you will. It's organized with categories, subcategories, and references. A copy of the framework is available as part of our online resources for Certify. You should take a look at those as we walk through today's training. The profile is how the implementation might happen based on your current status and where you want to go. And finally, we have the tiers. Those are used to describe the degree to which the business risk management practices exhibit the characteristics that we've defined in the framework. Those tiers are really an increasing degree of rigor, and we'll dive deeper into that. We'll show you examples of each of these, and let's start with the framework core. The core is made up of 5 components, and really a component is best represented as a function of your cybersecurity assessment. The first is identify. We use this to develop the organizational understanding of how to manage the risk to systems, assets, data, and capabilities. The second is protect. This is where we develop and implement the appropriate safeguards to ensure delivery of those organizational goals, assets, and services that we've identified. And then we have detect. This is used to develop and implement the appropriate activities to identify the occurrence of a cybersecurity event. Really, the detect function enables timely discovery of cybersecurity events. Next, we have respond. Here we develop and implement the appropriate activities to take action regarding a detected cybersecurity event. So we're going to respond with an action once we know that an event has occurred. And finally, we have recover. Here's where we develop and implement the appropriate activities to maintain plans for resilience and to restore any capabilities or services that were impaired due to a cybersecurity event. Let's start off now with an overview of the entire NIST cybersecurity framework and what you're looking at. On the left-hand side, we have an example of one of our 5 functions being recover. Within each of these, we have categories, a total of 23 categories actually, and then within those, we have subcategories totaling 108. That's right, 108. The 108 subcategories are outcome-driven statements, and that will provide consideration for creating or improving your cybersecurity program. Because the framework is outcome-driven and does not mandate how an organization is going to achieve their outcomes, it enables risk-based implementations that are customized to the organization's needs. In other words, how much cyber risk are you willing to tolerate? Let's look at the information references. Note the CSC, the COBIT-5, and the ISO 27001. Each of these are controls or requirements that you might have to work within depending on the compliance requirements of your clients. So it's good to know how the NIST controls will fit in with those other guidelines. We can see all the types of categories that fall under recover here and their various subcategories, all designed to guide the discovery process while aligning with industry standards. So I kept talking about outcomes when we're talking about the subcategories. An outcome is just what it sounds like, the desired state of each category and subcategory that's referenced in the 5 components. So for example, for identify, the first category we see is asset management. The desired outcomes are to identify the physical and software assets within the organization that need protection. Examples of these would be hardware devices, data, personnel, software platforms, applications, based on their classification, criticality, and their business value. Then we move down to protect. Let's zero in on the desired outcome for the category awareness and training. When we drill into awareness and training, we can see the subcategories or those outcomes are pertinent to what we are doing as MSPs now. All users are informed and trained. Privileged users understand their roles and responsibilities. Third-party shareholders like suppliers, customers, partners understand their roles and responsibilities. If you support, as an MSP, a nonprofit, for example, one of the third-party stakeholders might be a board member or the entire board. Senior executives understand their roles and responsibilities. Now, I know as an MSP, you understand how critical it is that the senior executives themselves participate in the awareness and training. And it's good that this is touched on as one of the outcomes for the awareness and training subcategories. For detect, we're drilling into detection processes now and their effective outcome. I've listed all of them here for you, but importantly, the third one you see in that list is the detection processes are tested. One thing that MSPs really need to take a look at. Going into respond, we want to make sure that response planning processes are executed during and after an incident, something we drill into in our Certify Cybersecurity Fundamentals for Engineers course. For recover, we have only one outcome for the category of recovery planning. The desired outcome being recovery planning processes and procedures to restore systems or assets affected by cybersecurity incidents. You can see how important each of these outcomes are and the sense that they make as you go through each category and subcategory. Now, to get to these outcomes, we need to walk through a series of questions posed by each category and then each subcategory. Going back to our earlier example in Identify for asset management, which is identifying physical and software assets within the organization that need protection, a question might be, what processes and assets actually need protection? In Protect, in our example of data security, the subcategory might get your outcome by asking what safeguards are available. For Detect, we're ensuring that anomalies and events are detected and their potential impact is understood. So a simple question might be, what techniques can identify incidents? For Respond, we're ensuring that response planning processes are executed during and after an incident. So our question might be, what technique can contain impacts of incidents? And then for Recover, we are ensuring the organization implements recovery planning processes and procedures to restore systems or assets affected by cybersecurity incidents. So our question might be, what techniques can restore those capabilities? Now we're moving to the next section on NIST implementation tiers. We'll see a definition of these tiers on the next slide, but important to note that each of these tiers is going to be used on each of the categories, not on the whole company. Effectively, these tiers could be low on one category and high on another. These are not a maturity model, however. They really are used to describe an increasing degree of rigor with which any given area would be implemented. These tiers take into consideration the threat environment, the legal and regulatory requirements, the business mission and objectives, and organizational constraints. These range according to the depth of the existing risk management process, the integrated program, which means internal sharing and collaboration, knowledge and awareness of the program, and external participation or existing maturity models that can be leveraged from other sources. While the companies identified as being in Tier 1 are encouraged to move into Tier 2 or greater, progression to the higher tiers is encouraged when such a change would reduce the cybersecurity risk and be cost-effective. We'll take a deeper look at this in another way. So let's take a look at the full description of the tiers. Tier 1 is called a partial implementation, and organizations at Tier 1 have an ad hoc or a reactive cybersecurity posture. They have little awareness of their organizational risk, and if they have any plans implemented, they're often done so inconsistently. You'll notice that they are not collaborating, if you look over at the fourth column, with anyone else. An example of this would be Cisco's voluntary program, where you can upload IDS data to their servers from your firewall, so it can be analyzed and then pushed down as a botnet filter or something similar if they're getting real-time specific information about malicious IP addresses. In Tier 2, you're more risk-informed, and the implementation is still piecemeal. They are more aware that they have risks, they have plans, and they have the proper resources to protect themselves, but they haven't quite gotten to a proactive point. Tier 3 is repeatable, meaning that an organization has implemented the CSF standards company-wide, and they're able to repeatedly respond to crisis. Policy is consistently applied, and employees are informed of risks. Tier 4 is adaptive. This tier indicates total adoption of the CSF. Adaptive organizations aren't just prepared to respond to threats, they proactively detect threats and predict issues based on current trends and their IT architecture. Note continuous awareness in the center column. Okay, we have an understanding of the core and implementation tiers. Now we're going to look at how a profile is created. Profiles are both outlines of an organization's current cybersecurity status and roadmaps towards the CSF goals. Having both current and goal profiles can help an organization find weak spots in its cybersecurity implementations and make moving from lower to higher tiers easier. Profiles also help connect the functions, categories, and subcategories to business requirements, risk tolerance, and resources. Think of profiles as a cybersecurity executive summary, compiled by what you just did in the previous two elements, being the core and the implementation tiers. It's this cybersecurity profile that you can use to take action on. So let's look at how this works. We'll start with the business objectives. So what are you trying to do? If you want availability, for example, let's start with data security controls. Then what are you applying to this business goal to ensure success? We would look at the control family, starting with the primary controls and then visiting the enhancements later when you're working toward a more mature program. We'll look at examples of these specific controls in a minute to help you understand them. Moving into the threat environment, this is where you basically need to know your vulnerabilities. What events are being monitored? What threats are you vulnerable to, like missing patches? Are you using RMM tools, right? If this is outsourced, you're going to need to ask for reports so you can understand what is being monitored. This is the purpose that your MSP serves. And then you would generate a business impact assessment. How do those threats that you have determined impact the business? And thirdly, you would be encouraged to reference additional resources. There's no need to recreate the wheel when it comes to this. When you're looking at the business requirements, if you follow the framework to determine the cybersecurity requirements that your business partners and customers have, it will help you to identify gaps in an organization's cybersecurity practices. It also provides a general set of considerations and processes for considering privacy and civil liberties implications in the context of a cybersecurity program. The plan phase begins based on these requirements. This generates the outcomes. Where do we want to go and how do we get there? And serves as a basis for ongoing operation of the system. This includes reassessment, capturing the results in a current profile so that we can verify the cybersecurity requirements are actually fulfilled. Profiles are about optimizing the cybersecurity framework to best serve the organization. The framework is voluntary, so there's no right or wrong way to do this. A current state profile takes into consideration the requirements, the mission objectives, and the operating methodologies along with current practices, and it compares that against the gaps to create a target profile. So in this example, we walk through the plan to schedule implementation of the items within the budget associated. You notice at the bottom of this, we have a line item that shows none as far as the investment. We simply represent that we need to keep an eye on this and the business impact in the future by a current and a future state X on the map of the quarters. So to make sense of the NIST profile, it really is an alignment of the organization's goals, the threat environment, and your policies and processes that support addressing those threats in one document. The best way that you can think about it is an assessment of where you are at now and where your target state is. From there, it becomes your decision support tool. This is what you bring to leadership to review what you have found and what you would recommend. We always find some kind of visual along with the report will be helpful. In this example, we have the green to red indicator at the top. But there are a lot of ways to present this, and we'll give you more examples in the Certify full-day training. This risk-based approach enables an organization to gauge their resources, meaning funding and staffing, to achieve their cybersecurity goals in a cost-effective, prioritized manner. So now let's go ahead and put the profile in action. There is another way to view the categories and the subcategories, and this is what helps us make the decisions on where we want to be once we know where we are. We're going to lay out our business objectives. We're going to determine the requirements based on legislation or regulation plus your own policies. The requirements and the business objectives are going to remain fairly static. Can we agree? Over the course of any given year, most businesses are not going to change their mission and their objectives, or the requirements that apply to them are not going to change. What won't remain static is the technical end or the threats and the vulnerabilities. This is why it's so important as an MSP that you learn how to create a profile, because the threats and vulnerabilities that do change and that are not going to be static are only a small part of the picture when you're comparing them against the business objectives and the requirements of the organization. So within each of these, you're going to dive into the subcategories to capture the relevant outcomes as they might apply to the organization. Once you have this, you're going to look at the operating methodologies that would apply to these outcomes. In other words, how do you implement it? So what is a control? A control will help us to set up our methodology or our implementation by giving us guidance on 3 categories: administrative, technical, and physical. Let's use the example of setting up remote access for an organization. In looking at what controls we need, we can implement automatic session termination or lock on all devices and systems. This would be a technical operational methodology or a technical control. Administratively, we would have a policy that users should log out of sessions if they're not at their desk. And then physically, we can limit access to sensitive resources by having a locked door that the administrator sits behind to manage the systems. Let's take a look at some more specific examples of controls. To make sure you understand the controls, let's dive just a little bit deeper into each of them. We'll start with the technical controls. These are familiar to all MSPs because they include things like hardware, software, access control, etc. The physical controls are also easy to understand, as they are the doors, the locks, the alarm systems, the security guards, etc. The administrative controls are the policies and procedures that are in place to make sure that the physical and the technical controls are effective. The administrative controls are the hardest for MSPs to get accustomed to, especially when it comes to implementation in cybersecurity. An example of administrative controls would be the policies and procedures behind things like acceptable use policy on company-owned devices, wireless access, remote workers. These are controls put in place to keep employees from making bad decisions. Now that you have an understanding of the NIST framework and the understanding of the technical, physical, and administrative controls, let's take a look at how we would apply these through the layers of security in the NIST framework. This is one of my favorite tools. When you can fill this grid out yourself, and you do have copies of these available for download as blanks, then you'll understand it well enough that you can have a conversation around this with your clients. Let's start with the administrative controls and how they would apply across the NIST components. In the administrative section, you'll see here that we have a list of policies. For example, in the Protect column, we have acceptable use policy, encryption policy, Wi-Fi, and security awareness training policies. For technical, you can see the difference, as these are real hardware and software solutions that are configured to achieve the goals of the component category. What kinds of things would go in physical? How about in the Identify column? You can see that we have a physical access badge, and then under Protect, we have door locks, signs, etc. Okay, let's take a look at what we'll do for the actual implementation steps. This is going to incorporate the core, the profile, and the implementation tiers. The NIST CSF provides this 7-step approach for the implementation and improvement of the cybersecurity posture of an organization. So let's bring this to life using a real-life example of a client I had when I was an MSP. We're going to use a communications firm that has an AD finance server, online data storage platform, cloud-based CRM, email using Office 365, and 20 desktops. In the prioritize and scope phase, we identify the mission and business objectives of the communications firm. We see that the mission of the business is to provide strategy and marketing campaigns to their end clients. The business objective is that strategy and content development is a high priority, but we also need to protect the IP from competition and generate media campaigns quickly to meet tight production deadlines. We need to accomplish this while staying within the confines of CCPA and LA County InfoSec contracts, as several of their end clients are LA County health-related entities. Next, to orient, we identify the assets, the requirements, and their applicable threats, and ask how do we combine those to know what our risks are. Let's look at another example in the communications firm. They need to meet regulatory requirements of CCPA as well as LA County InfoSec contracts. They need to communicate with banks and some clients using encrypted email. Email cannot be compromised. They need to use laptops to access online resources, which need to be password protected and encrypted. They have both the financial software and Active Directory running on the same server. They need high-speed, redundant internet for fast upload and processing of their campaigns. In creating the current profile, this is a where we are or a current state determination step. Based on what we saw earlier, we're only halfway in the current profile, showing us the subcategory, the description, and the priority based on our scope and orientation. For example, in our communications firm, if we take a piece of the NIST subcategories and start to populate them, we can see that the CFO and staff are using a third-party email encryption service, and we can align that in the proper NIST subcategory and prioritize it based on the exercise we just went through. What we see here is our grid and a reminder right now of what these abbreviations stand for. PR is protect, DS is data security, and the control number 1, 2, 4, you can see that we have abbreviations PR, DS, and the number. And that's how you know where to refer back to on the framework as you source each of these subcategories. We can see that we have antivirus running, and that aligns with the security continuous monitoring, which would go under the detect component with the subcategory being DE.CM-8, vulnerability scans are performed. Next, we'll do the assessment to see where the gaps are and populate the rest of the chart. In conducting a risk assessment, we're going to determine the likelihood of a cybersecurity event and what impact the event could have on the organization. In our communications firm example, the CFO is accessing the QuickBooks server by using administrator-level credentials. We can see that there's no backup policy in place for the online storage, email being Office 365, or the CRM system. And since the AD financial server used by the CFO is running on Windows Server 2008, there are numerous vulnerabilities pending. Now, in creating the target profile, this is all about the desired outcomes, the end game that you have in mind. As you go through the 108 subcategories applied to what we know about the business, we have to determine the priority of the risk. On a scale of 1 to 5, where 5 represents the best or most mature or comprehensive action, it's unlikely that any company's true risk profile or threat footprint is always going to merit the investment of a 5. Keep this in mind when you're trying to create your target outcome. Here's where we apply the concept of a risk appetite. How much risk in any particular vector or category does management think is prudent and appropriate to accept? In our example, when we're looking at the CFO using the administrator credentials to access QuickBooks in the Active Directory server, where would we rate this risk? So now we have a current profile and a target profile. Let's go ahead and prioritize the gaps. If we keep following our communications firm example, where the CFO is using administrator-level credentials to access the server, we see that this is actually an easy fix. Keep in mind, the prioritization is the hardest part sometimes and is often based on budget. Now that you know something about the difference between your current state and the desired future state, the gap between them becomes clear. This is a straightforward exercise, at least in determining the relative extent of each of those gaps. When we create the implementation action plan, we need to be mindful that these are not just technical solutions. It's when, how, and what policies need to be wrapped around what we're going to suggest for implementation. It's a lot more work, so be thoughtful about best practices here. An action for the server vulnerability might be simply to create a new user account for the CFO to access the server that does not have admin level rights. Another action could be to set up automated backups and a matching policy for the server and the off-site cloud storage. Think about how you're going to communicate the actions to the organization affected. What's being done? Why? The benefits to be gained by the company? How their organization will be affected? All the important matters to be shared along the way. How will the update and status reports be handled? The implementation plan needs to be very detailed. This is where the graphic representation of your action plan comes in. You can see each of the subcategory outcomes that we need to address, taken from the gaps identified in our current and future profiles. We have assigned them a priority and listed the severity of the associated gap for each. This is an opportunity to provide an indication of how much budget is required to address that vulnerability, but you don't have to include specific dollars here. The action plan can and should be used to guide the client to align on what the priorities are based on their budget and implementation timeline that makes sense. This diagram describes the overall process and flow of information and decision-making at the following levels within an organization. We start with the executive, and then we have the business and process level, and then we have implementation and operations. The executive level communicates the mission priorities, the available resources, meaning budget and/or personnel, and the overall risk tolerance that they are willing to accept. The business and process level uses this information as inputs into the risk management process, and then collaborates with the implementation or operations level to communicate the business needs and to create a profile. The implementation and operations level communicates the profile implementation progress back up to the business and the process level. The business process level uses this information to perform an impact assessment. The business process level management reports the outcomes of that impact assessment to the executive level, which informs the organization's overall risk management process, and also to the implementation and operations level for awareness of this business impact. So what's next? As I mentioned earlier, NIST is zeroing in on what they see as the most beneficial for MSPs to focus on in an effort to help small businesses become more resilient to cybercrime. We have the list of the initial 10 subcategories that NIST will focus on for me to review quickly with you here. At the ConnectWise Certify training, we'll start off assuming you now have a good foundational understanding of NIST, and we'll get into the details of the upcoming NIST for MSPs. But I'd like to introduce to you what we know is coming. First, it's important to know that only 3 of the 5 pillars of NIST will be addressed in NIST for MSPs, being identify, detect, and protect. Of these first 3 pillars, NIST has selected 10 subcategories to focus on for MSPs. I show you here the 2 that they chose within identify. The largest amount of subcategories for focus fall within the protect pillar. Here I show you the 7 that they will be focusing on. And finally, there's one subcategory within detect that NIST is focusing on for MSPs. As I said, I share these with you here, and as we develop the publications and the curriculum behind training for each of these, we'll bring these to you as fast as we can. Thank you for your time. This wraps up our introduction to NIST and the brief overview of NIST for MSPs. We hope that this training has been helpful for you to understand the NIST CSF cybersecurity framework and how it can apply to your MSP and the clients that you serve.